Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Dr. Paul Grimwood, formerly of the Kent Fire and Rescue Service. Is that right, Mr. Kinnear?
That's right, sir. May I call Dr. Grimwood?
Good, thank you. Good morning, Dr. Grimwood.
Good morning, sir.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
Correct.
So would you take the testament in your right hand and read the words on the screen, please?
Thank you. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Well, please sit down, make yourself comfortable there.
Thank you.
Yes, when you're ready, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. First of all, would you mind confirming your name for the record, please?
Paul Grimwood.
Thank you. Thank you very much for attending today, Dr. Grimwood. It's much appreciated. Just before I start the examination today, I should say three things. First of all, my questions are intended to be short and clear. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. If they're unduly long or unclear, please say so and I'll rephrase. Secondly, if at any stage you want a break, please don't hesitate to say so. There will be a morning break at around 11:15. But if you need a timeout over and above that, please say so. Finally, please do keep your voice up. That's so that the transcriber can capture everything you say and accurately. And please don't nod to indicate yes or no, as the case may be. Please indicate what your view is verbally. Now, you have provided four Rule 9 statements for the inquiry, and I'll just take you through those now. The first is dated the 24th of June 2020, which can be found at KFR 0000040. And is that your first statement? We can go to the...
Yes, it is.
And if we can go to KFR 0000054, it is your second statement of the 29th of January 2021.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And if we can go to KFR 0000058, we should find your third statement dated the 22nd of February 2021.
Yes, correct.
Thank you. And finally, your fourth statement dated the 12th of March 2021 is at KFR 0000060.
That's correct.
And have you read each of those statements recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm that the statements are true?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. And you happy for each of those statements to be taken as your evidence to this inquiry?
Yes, I am.
And your statements exhibit a total of 17 documents. Have you reviewed those exhibits?
Yes, I have.
Thank you. And have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming today?
No, I haven't.
Thank you. Dr. Grimwood, could we start by discussing your various roles and responsibilities during the course of your career? Am I right in understanding that you were the principal fire engineer at Kent and Fire and Rescue Service from 2009?
That's correct.
And are you still employed by Kent FRS?
Yes, I am.
In that role?
Yes.
Thank you. Is the role of principal fire engineer a non-operational role?
Very much so, non-operational.
And as far as I can make out, it has three principal parts. First, you oversee and support Kent's building safety team of fire engineers who are responsible for reviewing building plans and assessing fire engineering strategies. Is that right?
Yes.
The second component is responsibility for discharging Kent's functions in relation to building control consultations. Is that right?
Correct.
And finally, as well as the fire engineering aspect of your role, you've also developed, written and delivered operational information notes, technical bulletins and seminar training. And the topics on which you've worked include high-rise firefighting and command strategy. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Now, we'll come on to the detail of those particular subjects in due course. But am I right in understanding that you began your career as an operational firefighter at the London Fire Brigade in 1971?
Yes, I did.
And you've served there for some 25 years?
Yes.
And during your time as a firefighter with the LFB, you undertook a number of secondments to fire departments in North America. Is that right?
That's correct.
One was New York City,
Yes,
Boston, and Chicago.
amongst several others, yeah.
And am I right in understanding that you served as a firefighter on Long Island, New York, in the mid-1970s?
Yes, I did.
And during your secondments in the United States in particular, you tended fires in some of the world's tallest buildings, including the World Trade Center in New York and the Sears Tower in Chicago.
Correct.
To what extent did experiences of serving and observing operational practices abroad contribute to your understanding of and the approach to high-rise firefighting tactics in particular?
Well, it was an ability or an opportunity to gain tremendous amount of experience over a period of years with some of the busiest fire services in the world. Particularly in 1990, I was detached by London Fire Brigade for a period of 2 months, where I visited 10 cities specifically to study high-rise firefighting. So, yeah, a vast amount of experience that you couldn't perhaps gain in one service.
And is it unusual for fire officers to have similar opportunities to observing practices and tactics abroad?
It used to be unusual. It's quite common now. Fire services do sharing information and exchange visits, but certainly in the 70s, 80s, it was almost unheard of.
And how did those opportunities come your way?
Well, I was curious. I was stationed originally in central London, and we quite often had American firefighters come in to visit us. We'd have other fire services from Europe come in, and I always wanted to show the firefighters around the station and ask them questions about how they operated. And they asked me questions that sometimes I couldn't give answers to, and I was curious. I wanted to find out those answers, so I started to, research and study other services abroad just to see what I could learn from them.
Thank you. And as I understand it, you also have experience of acting as a training advisor to a number of fire and rescue authorities abroad, including fire and rescue authorities in the UK.
Yes, that's correct.
And on what topics have you provided advice in the past?
Advice or training, specifically mainly high-rise, compartment firefighting techniques, tactical ventilation, a range of operational fire, particular research studies, but it's been something. I've visited South Africa, Dubai, Canada, mainly to give that training.
Thank you. And you were awarded a PhD in fire engineering by Glasgow Caledonian University in 2015, is that right?
That's correct.
And your PhD thesis dealt with firefighting water requirements in tall and complex buildings, is that right?
Yes, it did.
And throughout your career, you've researched operational firefighting strategy and tactics, drawing on your practical experience of firefighting both in this country and abroad, is that right?
Yes.
And you've published 4 books on operational firefighting, I think, is that right?
Yes, three books on firefighting tactics and 1 book on fire engineering.
And those books were the intriguingly entitled Fog Attack in 1991, which explained the Swedish method of firefighting with water mist, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then 3D Firefighting in 2005, which encouraged firefighters to take control of the air track, the flow path, including by use of tactical ventilation and other means, is that right?
Yes.
And thirdly, Euro Firefighter number 1 in 2008.
Yes.
And then Euro Firefighter number 2. in 2017, I think.
Yes,
And the publication of Euro Firefighter number 2 predated the Grenfell fire, is that right?
yes, it did.
So in broad terms, all 4 books concern operational strategies and techniques that you consider can be deployed to enhance the performance of fire and rescue authorities across the world. Is that right?
Correct.
Can I now turn to the first substantive topic I'd like to discuss with you today, and that's stairwell protection strategy and the RICE concept. And by RICE, I mean R-I-C-E. Now, first of all, I'd like to ask you about the stairwell protection strategy that you introduced at Kent, and also about the related rescue, intervention, containment, and evacuation command decision-making tool, RICE, that you introduced during your time at Kent. Now, just so you understand the structure in which I'm taking matters, to the extent I can, I'm going to take matters chronologically. Now, in your first witness statement, and we don't need to go to it unless you'd like to, at paragraph 6, you refer to 2 serious wind-driven fires in Kent in 2001, i.e. before your time in Kent,
Yes.
where heat, and in one case fire, entered stairwells through doors that had been held open by hose lines. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you help us? The clue's possibly in the title, but what is a wind-driven fire?
So a wind-driven fire is where the outer skin or window of a fire compartment, a fire-involved compartment, is affected by wind that's blowing into that window, onto the face of that building. The faster the wind is, the more severe the fire event occurs. And it's likened to a blowtorch when it comes out the other side, which would be a doorway, a corridor, or a stair shaft.
Thank you. Now, you also say in paragraph 6 that those 2 fires were the precursor to the introduction of stairwell protection strategies at Kent. And you explain that first, in one case, the entire stairwell of a 15-storey building was heavily smoke-logged from a fire on the 10th floor. Was that is it Stainer Court fire in Ramsgate?
Stanner Court.
Stanner, thank you.
Yes.
And at that fire, there were residents who were unable to leave the building as a result of the smoke-filled stairwell and had to be rescued by the fire brigade. Is that right?
Yes, they were rescued by the fire service using external ladders, and also the Coast Guard were able to rescue some people off the roof using a helicopter.
And unfortunately, though, that fire resulted in 1 fatality. Is that right?
I don't believe it was that fire. Recollection, it would be the Arlington House fire where there was a fatality.
Just turning onto the Arlington House fire, you say that was a fire, a flaming combustion entered the stairwell from the fire floor on the 16th level of an 18-storey building. Is that, in broad terms, right?
Correct.
Thank you. And Arlington House fire was in Margate. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, at that fire, it was necessary for crews to go in and rescue residents who were unable to leave the building due to conditions in the stairwell. Is that a fair summary?
Yes. I mean, in both situations, the firefighting, the firefighting was held up, delayed for quite some time as firefighters were pushed off of the fire floor by the intensity of the fire, and the staircase. In one building, it was a single staircase. In the other building, it was 2 stairs, and it took some time before they were able to reinstate rescue operations. So people were trapped for some time.
Thank you. And the issue of stairwell doors being propped open by hoses occurs as a result of crews connecting to the dry riser on a different floor to the fire floor. For example, the floor below. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, is that practice what appears to be envisaged by the 2014 edition of the National Guidance on High-Rise Firefighting, Generic Risk Assessment 3.2?
Yes, it is.
And if we can go to that relevant passage so people can see what we're discussing, we can go to LFB quadruple 0 1255/28. And it's really the third paragraph from the bottom of that page which says this: hose lines must be laid and charged in an area unaffected by fire or smoke and behind the safety afforded by a fire-resistant structure or fire-resisting doors. And if we can look at the final paragraph on that page, which says this: branches should be supplied from the closest rising main outlet to the fire, which has not been affected by fire or smoke. And those paragraphs summarise the relevant advice that we've been discussing.
Yes, correct.
Now, in your experience, are those two paragraphs interpreted by fire and rescue authorities as guidance that hoses should be connected on the floor below the fire floor?
At that time is correct. When you look at building design going all the way back to the 60s, sometimes the rising mains were inside lobbies, off of the stair. As design evolved over a period of time, they were moved into the stair. So originally, firefighters would take one line off the fire floor into a flat if they were able to do so. But certainly by the time this document came out, it was accepted practice that they would take the first line from probably below the fire floor and the second line from the floor below that.
Thank you. And if we could just have a quick look at the LFB's policy note 633, which governed high-rise firefighting, which can be found at LFB *01256/13 and paragraph 7.35, and really the second sentence. It says this: the initial BA, so breathing apparatus team's charged branch, should, where possible, be supplied from the rising main outlet one floor below the fire. If this is unavailable, the nearest available outlet below, that should be used. And that's an example, is it, of the LFB's interpretation of what GRA 3.2 required?
The procedure that was in place at the time of the Grenfell fire, yes, that's correct.
Now, is it your view that this approach, the one exemplified by paragraph 7.35, immediately creates the risk that the stairwell will become compromised by smoke passing through the door of the fire floor that is propped open by the hose?
Without a doubt, that's true, and it's actually expressed in the GRA 3.2 that may happen.
Thank you. Now, if we could go and look at your first statement at KFR *000040/2 and paragraph 5. And you see at paragraph 5, you say this: stairwell protection is, and I quote, a proactive strategy that is directed at protecting occupants who may already be self-evacuating, whilst at the same time securing stairwells for an emergency evacuation should it ever be needed. The strategy is aimed at using all available means, tactics and resources to mitigate smoke infiltration into stairwells. Now, the first question that rises out of that is, what do you mean by stairwell protection being a proactive strategy?
So it's a strategy that expects smoke will come into the stair if the rising main is located in the stairwell. And if we take hose lines from below the fire floor, it's inevitable that you will get, in most fires, some smoke seeping into the stairwell.
Putting it differently, how does that differ from a reactive response to a fire?
So a reactive response, mainly in terms of reactivity, is that firefighters will react to what they find. But we're talking here about procedure, and it's specifically saying that it's something we expect. We expect the building to be doing this. We expect the building to be failing in terms of infiltrating smoke into the stair.
Thank you. Now, you say that the strategy is, quote, directed at protecting occupants who may already be self-evacuating, whilst at the same time securing stairwells for an emergency evacuation should it ever be needed. When the strategy was first introduced at Kent, was it recognised that in some cases it may be necessary for crews to carry out an emergency evacuation in a high-rise building with no pre-existing evacuation strategy?
For crews,
Yes.
firefighters, to evacuate?
Yes.
I think in any building, the potential exists for firefighters that they may have to have an emergency evacuation depending on the circumstances.
So the answer was yes, essentially.
Yes.
Thank you. When you joined Kent, so back in 2009, was it recognised that there may be situations, or rather, actually think about it, going to the point you make in slightly more detail, if we look at the Kent FRS policy on stairwell protection from 2006, it's probably easier to look at this issue in a sort of slightly more concrete example. And if we go to your first statement, and paragraph 6, which is on the page there, and in broad terms, you explain that as a result of the 2 wind-driven fires in 2001, Kent's practice was aimed at keeping stairwell doors closed as much as possible and maintaining the fire-resisting protection of the stairs, and that a Kent high-rise strategy group developed a supporting procedure. Now, you've exhibited a copy of that procedure, and if we go to it, we can find it at KFR *000050/1. Now we can see in the top right-hand corner the document's described as Technical Bulletin F for Freddie 15, Firefighting in High-Rise Residential Buildings. Now, is a technical bulletin the same as a policy document?
Yes, it is.
Was this document intended to be Kent's high-rise firefighting policy, or was it intended to be a supplement to another policy?
No, this was the firefighting policy for Kent in 2006.
And if we can look in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that this technical bulletin was published in December 2006. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, is that the first version of Kent's high-rise firefighting policy that was published?
It's the first version we were able to find.
And was this the policy that was in place when you joined in 2009?
Yes.
And is it safe to assume that you had no involvement in the drafting of this policy?
None.
None. Now, I think this is documents called TBF 15. Are you content for me to refer to it as TBF 15?
Absolutely.
Now, if we can go to page 2 and look at paragraphs 3 and 4. Paragraph 3 says this: the basic principle adopted in the design and construction of residential high-rise buildings is based on the structural subdivision and compartmentation of each floor of the building. This principle assumes that if a fire breaks out within a compartment, the communicating openings are properly protected. Theoretically, this should limit the size, development, and spread of any fire originating within a fire compartment. Unfortunately, these arrangements can be undermined by poor housekeeping, lack of correct maintenance, or the inappropriate actions of emergency service personnel. Paragraph 4 goes on to say this: experience has shown that fires in residential high-rise buildings behave in very unpredictable ways and can pose many problems to both the fire service and occupants in the building. As such, any operational deployment to a fire in a high-rise building must be taken with extreme caution, using all available pre-planning. Now, when you joined Kent in 2009, what was your understanding of the unpredictable ways in which fires may behave?
Well, the building sometimes doesn't perform as it's designed to. Generally, the design is good, but the maintenance and upkeep of the building design fire safety features tend to fail and aren't maintained well. Quite often that becomes a problem for local authorities because in some areas there's vandalism, fire doors are kicked through. So you can expect sometimes that the building will fail purely through the fire doors that have been damaged or poorly maintained. Does that answer your question?
It does. Looking at the final phrase in paragraph 4, you say the policy says using all available pre-planning. Would that include information gathered as part of the 72D process?
Yes, it would. Obviously, 72D has become a feature which is now being improved throughout the fire service. When it was originally a 11D, it would be just a familiarisation visit, and the fire service would just look at basically access and firefighting facilities. So they weren't really looking at the fire safety features of the building itself. As 72D, which is the same follow-on from 11D, as it has evolved, it's becoming more prominent now that the fire service should look at the fire safety features and make sure that things like fire doors are in place, that they're serviceable, and access provisions are there. And that's the kind of things that we look at now.
One of the things that we were discussing last week was the extent to which crews conducting 72D visits can be expected to pick up on differences of construction techniques and materials used. As a general proposition, would you be expecting crews, given your experience, to be picking up on differences of construction materials, panels and the rest of it as part of the 72D process?
Before the Grenfell fire, no. Since the Grenfell fire, we are now taking it into our own hands to train firefighters certain things to look for. But because the complexity of the external wall, for example, is so in depth, it's difficult for firefighters to understand the level of risk that an external wall would present.
Thank you, Dr. Grimwood. If we now go into the detail of TBF 15, one of the first matters that's addressed in the document is the evacuation of occupants, and in particular the importance of maintaining the integrity of the stairwell in order to facilitate an evacuation. Now, if we could stay in this document but move forward to page 5 and paragraph 20, which we see under the heading Evacuation of Occupants towards the bottom of the page. It says this: staircases, as well as providing a means of escape for occupants or residents, provide vital access for attending fire crews. It is important that the integrity of the means of escape is maintained at all times. Efforts should be made to keep doors from staircases to lobbies closed wherever possible. This point cannot be overstated. And then if we turn to paragraphs 21 and 22, 21 says this: when a building has more than one staircase, it is advantageous to utilise one for fire service purposes and the other as a means of escape for residents. However, it is likely that evacuating persons, particularly if panicked, will use either staircase to escape. Before giving the order, if we can turn over the page, and I think this is emboldened in the text, before giving the order to open up the affected compartment, the IC, the incident commander, must fully risk assess the situation. Consideration must be given to the potential adverse effects on any evacuation strategy and the safety of occupants above the fire floor. Now, flowing from this, is it important to consider the potential effect of opening up the fire compartment on any evacuation strategy, because entering that compartment may compromise the stairwell?
It's an essential consideration. Certainly in Kent, we've taken it very seriously from 2001 of the two fires that we've just discussed. Certainly since the World Trade Center fires, we've found that people will more likely to be using the evacuation stairways, even in the smallest of fires. So we expect people to be in the stairs almost at every fire we attend in a high-rise incident. So therefore, we need to make sure that that escape route is always there for them. And an incident commander certainly should consider what effect opening the fire compartment would have on anyone in the escape routes at that time.
Does it flow from that, therefore, that it may be necessary in certain circumstances to implement some form of evacuation before firefighters enter the fire compartment?
Yes, I mean, that could be a consideration, because the incident commander should be thinking about that as a tactical option. would it be better to hold the firefighting and clear the staircase, or would it be better to tackle the fire immediately? It's a balance, but certainly if people are in the stairwells or in the corridors evacuating, it's almost a priority to make sure that they are clear before the compartment's opened.
And to draw out another point, would it be right to say that in emphasising the importance of maintaining the integrity of the stairwell, the policy was recognising the prospect of self-evacuation and evacuation by firefighters?
Yes, the policy considers more the evacuation of residents than the evacuation of firefighters, but it's certainly obviously going to serve the purpose for both.
Sorry, it's evacuation by firefighters?
By firefighters, absolutely, yes.
Now, if we go further into the document TBF 15 and go to page 7 and paragraphs 36 to 40, and we see those paragraphs found under the heading Protected Lobbies. And they say this, and apologies for reading it out, but it's easier for people following elsewhere. Staircases within high-rise buildings should be protected with fire-resistant material, and access to them be via self-closing fire-resisting doors. It is important that personnel are aware of the problems that can be encountered if the protection afforded to staircases is compromised. Many high-rise buildings will have lobbies on all floors located off of staircases, and which are fire protected. Access can be made via a fire-resistant door to the floor's main corridor and flats. The FS63 record should include plan details of lobby layout together with location of dry riser outlets. Just stopping there, what's the FS6-3 record?
Okay, so for specific risks in Kent, and almost every high-rise building, they would go and do a 72D visit and then formulate a tactical plan, and that would be the FS63 record. So that tactical plan is specific to that building and that building alone because of the various layouts that they might encounter.
Going back to TBF 15, paragraph 38 says this: where an initial reconnaissance identifies that smoke has travelled into the lobby area on the incident floor, the deployment of hose lines from lower floors up to the incident floor will have the effect of breaching the protection afforded by the stairwell and may compromise the means of escape for other occupants. Incident commanders must carefully evaluate the risks of using this tactic, particularly if the building has a single stairwell. In such circumstances, the incident commander may conclude that a full evacuation is necessary prior to firefighting intervention. To ensure stairways are kept clear of smoke and the products of combustion, doors from lobbies to staircases should be kept closed. Every effort should be made to set into a riser outlet in the lobby of the floor on fire. And that last sentence is emboldened. Now, bearing in mind what's set out there, looking at fires where smoke has travelled from the fire compartment and into the lobby area, the advice in TBF 15 is that connecting the hose on lower floors will have the effect of breaching the protection afforded on the stairwell and may compromise matters. Just to be clear, is that because the smoke that has travelled into the lobby would then pass into the stairwell if a hose were to be connected on a lower floor and brought up and through the lobby door of the fire floor to reach the seat of the fire?
Yes, that's correct.
And so the practical problem is that the hose would be propping open two doors, or at least two sets of doors.
Yes.
And in that scenario, would it be preferable for crews to still try to connect to the rising main on the fire floor?
It would. Certainly in this situation, and this is a 2006 procedure, it shows a lobby between the stair and the accommodation. We don't always get that now because with more modern designs that have come up since 2006, they've basically removed that lobby. So now you come from the stairs straight into the corridor accommodation. But we still run the same process. In Kent, we've had our buildings redesigned where they now place them in the new buildings. The rising main outlet goes into the corridor itself rather than the stairwell.
Looking at this issue slightly differently, what are the risks that flow from connecting to the rising main on the fire floor? And why are those risks tolerable compared to connecting on the floor below, for example?
Yes. Well, I've never really understood why they've gone that way. As I say, way back when they had CP3 design buildings in the 60s, the rising main outlet was in the lobby corridor itself, right outside the flat doors, and that's where we would approach the fire from, on the fire floor. But over a period of time, they've developed what's called a firefighting shaft or a firefighting stair, which now gives protection to firefighters. And I think that's probably because in the past there's been instances where firefighters have been overcome by wind-driven fires and so forth. The way we deal with that now is a risk-assessed approach. We may not even open the flat door if there is a wind-driven fire on the face of the building, of the compartment involved. We may not even open it. So that's one of the things. The risk, the tolerability of the risk has to be taken from, certainly looking at it from balance of the risk, and certainly whether the risk is worth taking. If we turn up and there's smoke in the lobby, we would probably go from the floor below.
That's useful to know. Now, the need to consider whether a full evacuation is necessary before firefighting intervention is again addressed at page 12 of TBF 15. And if we go to page 12 on paragraph 63. Now, paragraph 63 is under the heading Fire Compartment, and I'd like to look at the first three sentences, the first one of which is emboldened and says this: the decision to enter a compartment involved in fire needs to be made having regard to the evacuation requirements of persons on and above the fire floor. The opening of any fire compartment, particularly in a high-rise building, is potentially extremely hazardous. The decision to open a fire compartment must only be made by the incident commander. And if we could just go further down in this page to paragraph 68, it says this: the use of controllable dividing breaching will enable both the firefighting BA team and safety jet BA team to set into the dry riser outlet on the same floor, preferably the fire floor, thus reducing the amount of hose required and the potential impact of products of combustion on non-affected floors. Now, taking the question of the dividing breach first, in lay terms, the dividing breach essentially splits the water flow at the dry riser outlet, enabling you to connect two hoses from the same outlet. In broad terms, am I right?
That's correct.
And this then means that the first two attack crews do not need to pull hoses in from lower floors, and the stairwell can remain closed.
That's correct. I think, as you see, this was a 2006 procedure. In 2006, just before this procedure was published, a fire service circular, a government circular was released, Home Office circular released to the fire services, based on experience of previous fires, recent fires, that now two lines should be laid, one being a safety line to support the attack line. And that's what it's there for. It's there for the purpose of protecting the attack crew on the first line. So it may never be flowed, but it's charged. And this was the first time that we were getting an instruction to lay two lines. So it required what had been before one line now to be divided. And the only way we could keep that on the fire floor would be to take up a dividing breaching.
And that's it. Distilled down, both crews could connect on the fire floor, and that's the advantage of the dividing breach.
Absolutely correct.
Now, looking at dividing breaches and the ability to connect two hoses to the same outlet, could we go back to your first witness statement on page 4, paragraph 10, and that can be found at KFR quadruple 0 00 40 /4. There we go. And if we look at paragraph 10, Dealing with this particular issue, you refer to another approach adopted by Kent. And that approach, in broad terms, encourages or requests the incorporation of rising fire mains with twin hose outlets in protected lobbies or corridors in buildings that are under construction. It's a point you touched on in an earlier answer. Now, paragraph 10, from the second sentence onward, you say this. This particular approach enables any fire and rescue service to request rising 150mm fire mains with twin hose connection outlets at each floor level to be located within the common lobby or corridor in some newly developed blocks of flats under regulatory consultation. These outlets are to be located common lobby side within 1 metre from the stair door for firefighter safety, and this in turn reduces the likelihood that hose must pass through open stair doors. The additional benefits in doing so are to reduce the amount of hose required when deploying from floors below the fire floor, and therefore greatly reducing the levels of physiological stress placed on firefighters. And just so people can see what we're talking about, can we go to KFR 00047? And is that a photograph of the twin outlet you're referring to in paragraph 10?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Now, when you say that a fire and rescue service is able to request that these mains be located within the common lobby or corridor in newly built blocks, those requests are made within the context of building control consultations to which the fire and rescue service is a party. Is that right?
Yes. So, going back to 1976, there was a British Standard 5306, Part 1, which allowed the fire services to have 150mm main at their choice. At that time, they could have 1 or 2 outlets per floor. It was an old standard that seems to have been lost over time. But there are certain standards that also deal with it, which is British Standard 9990, and that also allows the fire service to, up until 2015, when the standard was revised, it would allow the fire service to choose what size main and where it would be located with the outlets in the accommodation. That was changed in the 2015 standard of 9990, where it said they will now be in the stair to go, in accordance with building regulations. We anticipated this was coming in Kent, so we managed to get on the panel of the development of British Standard 7974, Part 5, where we reinstated that advice. So there's an option there, as you say, for us to negotiate design standard with the building control.
Thank you, Dr. Grimwood. From the lay perspective, there appear to be 2 principal benefits from using this twin outlet approach. And could I see whether I'm right in identifying those benefits? The first one appears to be by placing the mains in either the common lobby or in the corridor, there will always be at least one door in between the stairwell and the connected hose, so protecting the stairwell from smoke. In broad terms, am I right?
That's correct, and that was a requirement in the I think it was the GRA 32 originally.
And the second benefit appears to be that by using twin outlets rather than just the one, that achieves the same effect as a dividing breach.
Absolutely. I mean, the dividing breaching is a very heavy piece of equipment that firefighters have to carry up along with all their other equipment for a high-rise bridgehead. It's the heaviest piece of equipment that they carry. And where we're able to have it designed into the rising main, it saves a whole lot of physiological stress.
How heavy is a dividing breach?
Well, I would say it's something like 35, 40 kilograms.
Thank you. Now, if we can go back to your statement at KFR 0000040/4. Thank you. And if we can go to, you say there that in the first sentence, on the first and second lines, that this approach the twin outlet approach has been adopted by Kent and at least one other known UK FRS. Who's the other FRS, or which is the other FRS?
Hampshire Fire and Rescue.
And did they adopt it for the reasons that Kent did?
Yes, they did.
Do you know whether any other fire and rescue services have begun to take the twin outlet approach?
We've had requests for information about it. Certainly believe some services have said they're going to take that route. Whether they have done so at this stage, I can't answer.
Thank you. I now want to turn on to a separate topic, which is the scenario-based guide and the stairwell protection in pictures. And for this purpose, can we go back to TBF 15, which is at KFR quadruple 0 00 50 and page 13. Thank you. Now, in broad terms, what we have here is a scenario-based guide which illustrates how the steps of the procedure should be followed in practice. Is that right?
Correct.
And here, a scenario involves a report of a fire on the 9th floor of a residential high-rise of 13 floors with a single protected staircase that is unaffected by smoke and a fixed dry riser outlet, which we can see within the lobby if we can de-amplify. And we see the fixed dry riser outlet, I think I'm right in saying, at the very bottom and the centre of that plan. Is that right?
Correct.
Thank you. And it's the little red rectangle. Now, the scenario guide breaks down the operational response into a number of phases. And could I discuss with you those various phases? And the first one of which can be found at page 14. And so the first phase is assessment, and that's establishing the suspected location of the fire, and once that is known, identifying where the bridgehead can be established, which is typically 3 floors below. Is that, in broad terms, correct?
Yes.
The second phase is illustrated at page 15, so overleaf. And that is the reconnaissance and evacuation phase. Is that right?
Yes.
And that involves, first of all, maintaining access and egress, stairwell integrity, under which the initial team, including the sector commander, are deployed to reconnoitre the integrity of the stairwell, the proposed bridgehead, and the suspected incident floor. Again, in broad terms, is that right?
Yes.
And as part of that phase, the lobby floors are checked on the way up. Is that right?
Correct.
And using vision panels and touch. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And so the crews will not enter the lobby floors. They'll just check conditions to the extent they're able to as they're going up.
Yes.
And if smoke or fire is detected on any of the lobbies of the lower floors, what would you expect crews to do?
If there was smoke on lower floors, it depended how much smoke there was. Certainly they would investigate if it was just a light haze of smoke. The intentions or the objectives of the reconnaissance team is to locate the fire. And sometimes that's not so easy to do. We might have reports of a fire on the 12th floor, but the alarm panel says the fire's on the 14th floor. So the reconnaissance will check each floor as they go up, and if there's smoke on a lower floor, they would check that because it may be directing them to the actual source of the fire.
Thank you. Just looking there on the page we're looking at, paragraph 79, end of the first sentence, it says the various means of identifying whether there's smoke or fire spread on lower floors, panels, touch, and TIC. I should have asked you, what does TIC mean?
So it's a thermal image camera.
Thank you. Now, assuming no smoke or fire is detected on those lower floors or lobbies, the crews locate the incident floor and assess from the stairwell how safe it is to commit to the lobby area of the incident floor. Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, crews will not be opening the stairwell door at this point. They're merely trying to establish, to the extent they can, what the conditions are like.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, there appears then to be a second part of the reconnaissance and evacuation phase, and that's dealt with at page 16. And that second phase is maintaining access and egress bridgehead integrity. First of all, what is meant by the phrase bridgehead integrity?
So it's looking for basically where we're going to set up a bridgehead, a command post, a staging post for firefighters to base a safe area from which they can advance.
Thank you. Now, the initial team then enter the unaffected lobby, and the sector commander monitors the conditions in the corridor through the vision panel for any deterioration in conditions. Is that right?
That's correct.
And an important element of this is that the sector commander does not enter the corridor. Is that right?
Yes.
And why does he not do that? It may be obvious.
It's just a safety feature, just to make sure that the firefighters should be, the first two firefighters should be equipped with breathing apparatus, although they won't be wearing it at that time, and he won't. The officer won't be.
At this Understood.
Yeah.
But at this stage of the response, what would you expect crews to do if conditions deteriorated markedly?
So if they decided that it wasn't safe to enter, then they would basically go back to the floor below and set up a bridgehead and accept that that's probably where the fires are originating from.
Now, as the sector commander continues to monitor conditions from the corridor, the crew set out their equipment ready to connect to the dry riser within the lobby. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it right that you would not expect crews to connect to the riser at this stage?
Which paragraph are we on?
We're looking at paragraph 82.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And so throughout this time, it's crucial that the door to the stairwell remains closed.
Yes.
Now, there is a third element of the reconnaissance and evacuation phase, which is dealt with at page 17, and that is focused on instant location and evacuation. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, it's at this stage that the first crew will enter the corridor with the sector commander from the protected lobby if conditions are considered sufficiently safe. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we can look at the diagram at the bottom of page 17, we can see that the crew is without any firefighting equipment at this point. I think you've alighted to that in a previous answer. Is that right?
Yes.
And the hose remains in the protected lobby and is yet to be connected. Again, is that right?
Yes.
Now, when the affected compartment is located, crews will at that stage immediately evacuate all unaffected flats or compartments on the instant floor. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it also right that this is before any intervention has taken place in relation to the compartment of origin?
Correct.
Now, in terms of how you'd expect crews to evacuate the fire floor, would that simply be a question of knocking on doors?
Yes, it would.
And then escorting residents presumably to the stairwell and, if necessary, outside?
Certainly to the safety of the stairwell, yeah. And one would assume that they would make their own way out.
How is that process adapted or made to fit circumstances where there are residents with vulnerabilities or limited mobility issues?
Well, this is a risk zone, and by opening the fire compartment, it will make it riskier, more risky. So certainly, whoever is in that lobby in a flat will be asked to leave. If there are vulnerable persons in there, they will be assisted out. The importance is to clear the fire floor of residents.
One of the issues, just whilst we're dealing with this point, you mentioned previously the information that's collated for the tactical plan in Kent.
Yes.
When you're gathering information, or when you were gathering information at Kent, would you have identified, first of all, the number of vulnerable residents or those with limited mobility within the high-rise building?
In 2006, I can't say we would have.
Before 2017, would you have done so?
Certainly even in 2006, it may be a local crew would ask that question of, are there vulnerable residents in this building?
And would they ask where are they?
Yes.
Would they ask what types of vulnerabilities or limited mobility issues affect the individuals in those flats?
Yes, but it would be an ad hoc basis at that time.
And Kent's policy would not direct visiting crews to collect that type of information?
No, I think it would be probably the individual officers who were attending that would show their concern for that sort of thing. But I don't think it was documented at that time.
In your experience, how frequently would that type of information be collected in Kent for the purposes of the tactical plan?
Now?
Pre-2017?
Pre-2017. Again, I think it would be an ad hoc basis.
But again, no policy or no express instruction from the powers that be that crews should collect that type of information?
No, I think there was good liaison with local housing authorities. There was always concern expressed in that way. And I think officers, operational officers were told probably it's a good thing to go and make that part of your 72D visit. But I don't remember any documentation on that sort of thing.
Thank you. Would you ever expect crews to evacuate residents from more than just the fire floor?
Yes.
And if I can stop you there, in
Yes.
what circumstances would you expect that to happen?
Okay, well, if it's a confirmed fire, and this was a training aspect, some people would do it, some wouldn't, but it depended on training, that we would consider the flat immediately above the fire flat to be evacuated as well. That was always a consideration as a risk zone. To evacuate the whole floor above the fire floor is sometimes recommended, but rarely done.
And why is it rarely done?
For a matter of time, I think.
And how would you expect the broader evacuation process to be carried out? Would it essentially reflect what's taking place on the fire floor itself?
Yeah, I mean, if we've confirmed that there is a fire in a flat before we're going to make entrance, in other words, if the flat door is closed, and we might take a look through the letterbox to see the state of the fire, we might touch the back of the door. But certainly, if we've confirmed a fire in a flat, we would clear the fire floor.
Thank you.
In 2006.
Thank you. And looking at paragraph 90 just above this diagram, we see that once the evacuation of the floor has been carried out, the crew will withdraw to the lobby again. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, there's a fourth and final part to the reconnaissance and evacuation phase, which was withdrawing after reconnaissance and evacuation. And that's dealt with at page 18. So again, over leaf. And we can see from the diagram that at this point, the sector commander and the crew are back in the lobby, and the door to the corridor and the door to the stairwell are both closed. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, the crew then lay out 2 hose lines from the controlled dividing breach. Is that right?
Yes.
And here the phrase lay out here means to connect to the outlet. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. And using the dividing breach means they're able to connect 2 hoses into the same outlet as we discussed previously.
Yes, correct.
Thank you. Crucially, they will not charge those hoses with water, and they will not use the hoses at this stage. Is that right?
Yes.
But the idea is that the hoses will be picked up by later crews to follow.
Correct.
And then once all that is done, the sector commander and crew then return to the bridgehead, wherever that might be.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the next stage is the intervention phase, and that is dealt with at page 19. Now, in broad terms, the intervention phase, put this crudely, is happening at the bridgehead while the initial reconnaissance and evacuation is taking place. Is that right?
Could you rephrase that?
Yeah, The intervention phase is describing what's going on at the bridgehead, while the initial reconnaissance and evacuation phase has been completed.
Yes, I mean, crews would be coming up to the bridgehead, which had been confirmed by radio from the reconnaissance team, advising which floor to set that up on, and crews would be preparing there for an intervention.
Thank you. Now, at the bridgehead, a minimum of 4 BA teams, that's breathing apparatus teams, are briefed and ready to be committed under air to the fire floor. Is that right?
Yes.
And we'll see in a moment, 2 of those BA teams will then enter the incident floor, one as the first attack team and the other as backup. Is that right?
Yes.
And the 3rd team will be deployed in the stairwell and the 4th as the emergency crew at the bridgehead. In broad terms, is that right?
In broad terms, yes.
Thank you. Now, coming back to GRA 3.2, the 2014 edition that was in force at the time of the Grenfell fire appears only to suggest that the use of 2 BA crews at this stage. And if we go to what GRA 3.2 says, and I'd be interested in your views on this, LFB quadruple 01255/28. And it's really the 4th paragraph from the bottom of that page. And what that says is this: a breathing apparatus team must only be committed with extinguishing equipment that has been assessed as suitable and able to provide sufficient weight of attack. And then if we can go to the 2nd paragraph from the bottom, it says this: an additional breathing apparatus team with a 2nd jet must protect personnel involved in rescue firefighting operations as soon as possible. Now, am I right in reading GRA 3.2 as only suggesting the use of 2 BA crews?
Yes, there is the acting on the fire service circular we talked about earlier, the request for 2 hose lines, one being a safety line, one being an attack line, should be laid. In this case, it says that the safety line should be laid as soon as possible. So not necessarily at the first instance.
So the Kent configuration of a quartet, 4 BA teams, is that different from practices you've encountered being used in other fire and rescue services?
Yes, very much so. I've got to say, I wasn't part of the formation of the 2006 procedure. There are aspects of it that I liked very much, and there were aspects of it I didn't like. And we, on the high-rise strategy group, debated this over a period of time, and what I would say is that in 2012 we updated TBF 15 again.
Thank you. Which aspects did you like, first of all, and which aspects didn't you like?
Clearly, I like the stair protection feature. I like the safe approach that they took and the prioritising of making sure that a fire compartment wasn't opened before residents were clear of the stairwell. They kept the doors closed. They attacked from the fire floor, so that was another feature of protection to the stair. I like the idea that they were evacuating the fire floor, but I wasn't happy with the 3rd line, which was placed into the stair to protect the stair.
And you referred in an earlier answer to debating the advantages and disadvantages internally at Kent of the 4 BA crew approach.
Yes.
When TBF 15 came to be revised in 2012,
yes.
Did you stay with the quartet regime, or did you abandon it in favour of something else?
So we had 4 firefighters on the fire floor with 2 hose lines, and that was the minimum. We used the 3rd line to approach the floor above the fire floor and protect the flat that was immediately above the fire. But that was an addition. That was it wasn't an essential before we attacked the fire.
And those additional features go beyond what GRA 3.2 appears to be advising. Is that a fair reading?
Yes,
And that was something which you felt was a necessary and desirable addition?
absolutely.
Thank you. The next part of the intervention phase, going back to TBF 15, is stairwell protection by the first offensive team. And if we can go to KFR *0050/20. Now we see the subheading there at the bottom of the page that says stairwell protection. And if we see, or look at rather, paragraph 100, the first CABA team, CABA, what's that?
Compressed air breathing apparatus.
Will lay out and charge a covering jet from the floor above the bridgehead up the stairwell to the entrance to the lobby of the affected floor. Is that right?
Yes,
Thank you. And the policy is clear that this crew must not enter the lobby of the affected floor, as that would breach the integrity of the critical door. Is that right?
yes.
And if we can turn over the page to page 21, again, the diagram helpfully shows that the crew remain in the stairwell. Is that right?
Correct. That's the third line that I was talking about that we changed.
I was about to ask.
Yeah,
And their hose, so the crew that remain in the stairwell, their hose is connected 2 floors below the fire floor, and the door to the fire floor, crucially, is closed.
yes,
Thank you. Now, this crew's, please shout if I'm putting this too simplistically, this crew's sole function is to protect the means of egress within the stairwell. Is that right?
yes. It's to protect the means of egress and to protect fire entering the stair.
And so keeping the stairwell clear of smoke or fire, in broad terms.
Correct. This was the subject of debate of the strategy group for the 2012 update.
What were the competing pros and cons?
Well, I think they were responding to one of the fires that they had where in 2001 where fire had gone into the stairwell, and in that situation we had the same floor layout here, but the hose line was taken from below the fire floor up through the doors into the fire floor, and then fire came out of the flat from a wind-driven fire into the lobby, into the stair, and completely cut off the stairwell. Now, we argued the fact that that may have been just one incident, that to have this situation where we are laying from the fire floor with the fire door closed would alleviate that risk. So we thought we could use the resources in a better way rather than just placing a hose line out there.
Thank you. Could we look at the bottom of page 21, so below this diagram, and we see that there's provision now for the second offensive team, who are there to provide hallway and egress protection. Is that right?
Yes,
Now, the second offensive team, they enter the lobby on the incident floor and charge one of the 2 existing hose lines from the controlled dividing breach, and then take it into the corridor. Is that right?
correct.
And if we could turn over the page to page 22, it is that action which is shown in the diagram at the top of the page. Is that right?
Yes,
Thank you. They then take the hose near the affected compartment, but they don't enter. They don't enter the compartment or indeed open the door in any way. Is that right?
correct.
What they do instead is that they use their hose line as a protective spray or curtain in the corridor to maintain its integrity. Is that right?
That was the written objective. I think more likely they were just there with a closed branch hose line just to add a safety feature. They weren't running or flowing water at that time.
And really flowing from that, their principal or sole function was to protect the means of egress to the stairwell.
For the attack team.
Would it also be the case that by maintaining conditions in the corridor of the fire floor, that's making access to the corridor easier for the third offensive team?
Probably not. If conditions were that bad, we would be either coming back and approaching it from the floor below or attacking the fire at that time. I mean, if they were there in that situation and the door was open, they would probably practically proceed into the open compartment, but they wouldn't open it if it was closed.
Thank you. Now, turning to the third offensive team, they're the entry firefighting team, is that right?
Yes.
And if we go to the bottom of page 22, we see a description here of their role and function. And in broad terms, it's this third offensive team that enters the lobby on the affected floor and takes the second hose that is set into the dividing breach into the corridor, and they then move close to the fire compartment. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we turn over the page to the top of page 23, is that what the diagram is showing?
Yes.
Thank you. And once the crew has secured approval from the incident commander, they will enter the compartment and start firefighting activities. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, finally, as part, and we're still dealing here with the intervention phase, there is incident progression and support, and we can find that addressed at the top of page 24 of TBF 15. And if we can look at paragraph 113, there's a direction there along the following lines. A safety officer should be positioned in the stairwell at bridgehead level to monitor for any downward smoke travel. And we can see that safety officer in the diagram at page 25. And if that could be blown up, thank you. And the safety officer is on the other side of the lobby door on the bridgehead floor in the stairwell. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And again, presumably that's to ensure that the integrity of the stairwell is maintained at all stages of the operation.
Yes, I think that's the case, and that officer there would be particularly relevant to the protection of the crews as well.
Thank you. And does it also flow that the safety officer will have the responsibility for ensuring the safe egress of occupants evacuating?
It would serve that purpose, yes.
And is it also correct that the doorway curtains can be deployed at any of these stages of the procedure?
Not at this time.
And why not?
We didn't have door curtains in 2006.
When did they come to be introduced?
Well, they started in Germany probably around 2000, but we didn't get them in the UK. We certainly trialled them, but they were considered too cumbersome at the time, as we had enough equipment to carry up. So they weren't popular here.
Can you briefly describe door curtains for us?
Okay. A door curtain is something made of fire-resistant material. It's basically a swinging curtain that has a frame that you can put into a doorway and extend so that it holds tight into the doorway itself. And it has a small opening at the base of the curtain, allows the smoke to be kept within and firefighters to go in and out of that opening to fight the fire. It's just an added protection of smoke coming back out.
You said they were cumbersome. Can you give the panel an idea how heavy was a set of curtains?
They're not particularly heavy, but they are quite large, so probably would be about a metre square in its folding container, and again not heavy but cumbersome to carry, so added with all the other equipment.
The dividing breach and the rest of it.
That's right, it was considered too much.
Now, when you did have doorway curtains, on which floors would you expect to use them?
So you could use them on the fire compartment itself, the main flat door. You could use it at the stair door. You could use it at the lobby door. Depends how many you had, but you have extra layers The only thing with stair curtains is that they aren't guaranteed to stop a wind-driven fire. So if the external window of the flat is broken and then there's a high 20-mile-an-hour plus wind coming in, it will bypass those curtains and smoke will travel into open areas.
Dr. Grimwood, thank you. Sir, with near immaculate timing, that comes to an end of this topic and may well be an appropriate time for a break.
Yes, thank you. Well, as Mr. Kinnear said, Dr. Grimwood, we have a break during the morning, and I think this is a good time to take it. So we'll break off now and we'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And while you're out of the room, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone else.
Thank you, sir.
All right? Thank you very much. Well, at your own pace, please go with the usher. Thank you, Mr. Kinnear. 25 to 12.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Would you ask Dr. Grimwood to come back in, please?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
All right, Dr. Grimwood, you ready to carry on?
Absolutely.
Good, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Can we now turn to the development of the RICE command decision-making tool, and in particular, the influence and the lessons you derived from your time in Kuala Lumpur? Now, following the development of Kent's guidance on stairwell protection in 2006, you explain in your statement that you developed the RICE model in 2008 when you were engaged in training high-rise firefighters in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Is that right?
That's correct.
First of all, what was your role in Kuala Lumpur?
So I was commissioned privately to train the high-rise firefighting teams in Kuala Lumpur over a 6-week period.
And presumably, and shout if this isn't true, Kuala Lumpur, or accurate, Kuala Lumpur has a relatively high number of complex high-rise buildings.
Yes, it has 450 super tall buildings and a large range of smaller buildings. So it was a really good learning experience for me as well, but certainly interesting to see how Malaysian firefighters approach the problems.
Thank you. Now, at the time of your work in Kuala Lumpur in 2008, the model that is now the RICE model was referred to as ICE, which was intervention, containment, evacuation. The explicit rescue component came later, is that right?
Yes, although rescue was included in ICE, but it was a subset. So during a later strategy meeting we had in Kent, they wanted it raised to a primary consideration, which it always was. But it was just the way the flowchart was laid out, so it became RICE.
Thank you. Now, we don't need to go to it, but at paragraph 13 of your first statement, you explain that the RICE model serves as a prompt so that fire commanders are able to focus equally on the 4 primary strategic choices in a building fire. Now, can I go through those 4 strategic choices with you? First of all, rescue. And the reference to rescue in this context is specifically to savable life within the fire compartment. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And the rescue component in the RICE model essentially directs a commander to consider whether action needs to be taken as a priority to carry out a rescue from the fire compartment before any other of the usual steps are taken, such as setting up an initial attack BA team and the rest of it.
Correct.
The second stage is intervention, and that refers to entry into the fire compartment to extinguish or control the fire there. Is that right?
Yes.
And you would expect crews in Kent to do this following the procedure that we've just considered, i.e. set out in TBF 15, is that right?
Yes.
And so it's the Kent Quartet 4-team formation.
Yes.
The third element is containment, and that refers to the need to prevent the fire from spreading to surrounding compartments. Is that right?
Yes.
And would that require crews to be in place whose responsibility was to monitor fire spread and to take action if any spread occurred?
Yes, it would be. Certainly containment can be from the exterior, could be an exterior stream, or it could be internally.
That was my next question.
Okay.
So thank you for preempting. So that would include monitoring for the external fire spread as well?
Yes.
And where would you expect those crews to be located dealing with containment?
Well, containment would be a tactical option. It may, and to make it clear, the RICE mnemonic is not something that has to be done in any specific order. It's a case of...
Again, you preempted a later question.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
So in terms of containment, it would be something that they decided, it might be a wind-driven fire, for example, that we're not going to open up the compartment at this particular time because of the risk to residents on the fire floor or in the stairwells. So we would contain the fire by keeping doors closed. And there may be some external streams used if we've got access. And there may even be some approaches to direct fog tactics into the compartment itself using piercing nozzles.
Now, obviously, I appreciate that much depends upon the nature of the
Yes.
fire, the nature of the building,
Yes.
and the rest of it. But what action would you expect to be taken where there was external fire spread from the compartment of origin?
Well, if it's an external fire, that quite commonly we would see going to the floor above, not necessarily into the floor above, but threatening the floor above. Containment action might be to deploy a crew to the floor above and enter the flat there with a hose line. But if we've got access to an aerial appliance, we would use an exterior stream to control fire spread, or we would use ground monitors.
I was about to ask about ground monitors.
Yeah.
How useful would they be in terms of containment of an external fire spread?
Depending on the height of the building, very useful. And of course, in Kent, we're not London. We don't have any buildings that are over 20, 23 floors. But even at those heights, you can be hard pressed to reach a fire at high level.
Thank you. The fourth and final stage is evacuation. And is it right that this stage involves considering first the primary risk zones?
Yes. So we term the primary risk zones as the areas that are most at risk for residents or occupants, and that would be the fire floor itself. Certainly in those areas, that's the primary risk zone.
It's immediate risk. Is the
Immediate risk.
Can you explain in a typical flat fire what the primary risk zone would be?
In a flat fire, the primary risk zone would be mainly the lobby area or the corridor serving the flats on the fire floor, or the flat above the fire.
So it's not confined to the compartment of origin.
No.
And the secondary risk zones, presumably they're the more remote areas.
Absolutely. So we would consider secondary risk zones as the stairwells and then flats above.
And those are the areas where occupants ought to be protected for at least a limited period of time if there are adequate fire safety measures in place.
Absolutely.
Now, probably be useful to go to it. If we can go to paragraph 15 of your first statement, KFR *004040/5, and it's paragraph 15. And we see in the second sentence of that paragraph, and it goes over to page 6, you say this: "It is important to emphasise that RICE is not a policy or procedure, but a command decision-making tool. It is primarily an aide-memoire used to alleviate command stress and prompt a predetermined, rapid analytical thought process, where local or total building evacuation may be given earlier consideration prior to a firefighting intervention. The model can be applied to all multi-storey building types, covering a variable range of occupancies, and is not specific to just very tall buildings." Now, taking that stage by stage, what is the difference between, on the one hand, a policy or procedure, and a command decision-making tool on the other?
So a command decision-making tool such as RICE is purely an aide-memoire to try and direct a commander, probably first on scene certainly, to relate to the most primary concerns in terms of the tactical options that he or she might choose.
Why is it important to stress that the RICE model is a model and not a policy?
Okay, well, interestingly, it is now a policy in Kent, but during the process of evolution, we developed not the procedure, the mnemonic. It was purely, as I say, only used initially in training, and then it was used with a documented guide, and then it was brought into a procedure where the different aspects of the tactical options relate to how many hose lines the crews must lay out before they do certain things. For example, now we can use one hose line to enter a situation where it's an R, a rescue, whereas before we would have to have 3 in 2006 and 2 in 2012.
One point which was made by Dr. Cohn-Hatton last week, and I think Professor Torero makes it in his reports, is that a decision model helps commanders in formulating their own plan, and that will inevitably depend upon particular circumstances and will rely much on the incident commander's discretion, whereas a policy will direct the incident commander what to do. Is that a distinction which you accept as being legitimate?
I would accept that, absolutely, certainly. You could say that RICE sits in the plan formulation part of the process that Sabrina Cohen-Hatton recently introduced.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but you said that RICE does not require a mechanistic process through each of its components. Components can be taken out of order. Is that, first of all, I think that's right, but could you explain why the decision-making tool can be adapted in that way?
Yes, that's correct. Well, it's a tactical set of options, and we try to keep it brief. I've seen some flowcharts of other mnemonics used, which have been complex and difficult to remember on scene. RICE is a short, sharp approach, and it's based on risk assessment, which is the most important option to be taken at any particular time.
And so, flowing on from our earlier discussions, it's possible, depending upon the circumstances of a fire, to take the E element, i.e. evacuation, before any of the other three.
Absolutely, yes.
When you formulated the model, did you have in mind the sorts of possible circumstances that might require a commander to implement matters out of sequence, if I can put it that way?
Well, you know, when I first introduced it, it was a simple compartment fire tool in house fires. So we had a series of house fires where firefighters would turn up and would respond to the things that were most important to them, which was firstly rescue, secondly firefighting, and there were a series of fires where firefighters lost their lives because they chose those options. If they'd have chosen another option, they would have perhaps had a better outcome. So that's where it was originally developed from, and certainly in terms of evacuation in a high-rise building, that's always been an important topic, certainly in commercial buildings. I've never agreed with the fact that people should have a stay-put policy. I believe that a stay-put policy means that the escape routes should always be available to residents should they need them. So evacuation was important.
Really flowing on from the importance of evacuation, is it inherent in the RICE model that it encourages commanders not to assume that buildings may behave in one way? It's encouraging them to assume that fires may behave unpredictably.
Well, we teach firefighters to expect failure. We expect a building to perform against the way it's designed to perform. And even if a building does perform as designed, there are conflicts in the regulations. We talked earlier about the position of rising mains in stairwells. That's always going to be a conflict where firefighters want to attack a fire quickly.
And were your Kent firefighters specifically trained to assume that fire may well spread outside a compartment of origin?
Yes, certainly a situation could occur where a fire spreads into the lobby. That's why we prioritise the primary evacuation area, the lobby or the corridor itself, and evacuate those flats before we enter. And certainly a fire could lightly spread up the face of a building to the floor above. That's quite common. Not always threatening to enter that part of the building, but certainly it's a risk.
Thank you. Now, going back to the training that you were providing in Kuala Lumpur back in 2008, when you first formulated the RICE concept, what training were you providing at that time in Kuala Lumpur?
Well, it was, first of all, one had to assess their level of knowledge and understanding. So the first week was pretty much doing that to see, you would expect where they have so many high, tall buildings, they'd be really efficient. But there were areas where they could certainly receive training. And we looked at, for the first 2 weeks, tower blocks, flat fires, basic, what firefighters would call bread and butter jobs, just the one-room flat fire on the 4th floor that didn't come outside the compartment, the flat itself. And then we looked at some of the bigger buildings that they had in Malaysia, which were some of the very tall office blocks.
And how did you use the RICE tool as part of this training?
Well, the RICE tool was mainly used in the tower block fires or tower block training because they weren't responding well. They had no concept of forming a plan. They had no idea of anything outside firefighting intervention. That was their first and primary concern. So the objective there was to try and show that there were other ways to approach a fire that may have better outcomes.
And presumably the training addressed unexpected building failure.
It really was basics. It was very much a basic approach, taking building features, building systems, and integrating that with their tactical approaches.
Now, once you developed and deployed the RICE model in Kuala Lumpur, it's right that you introduced it in Kent by a series of 9 high-rise training seminars. Is that right?
Yes, we introduced it after we'd had the first 2 seminars where there were failures in understanding.
And they were delivered to incident commanders in 2010 and 2011, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Did you prepare the content of the training?
Yes, I did. I prepared 60% of it.
And who are the other authors? Can you remember now?
The other assistant was Steve Glass. He's a station commander. He's now retired.
Thank you. Now, you explained in your statement that the training included an assessment called the Fire Studio. Can you explain what that assessment involved?
Okay, so the Fire Studio is a computerised training program that was commonly used back then. It's not virtual reality, but it's basically using a cinema screen with a fire scenario placed on the screen. The particular assessment that we gave with the Fire Studio was the end of the course. It was I think it was a 2 or 3 hour course assessment where there was fire spreading up the outside of a building. It spread to 5 floors, to involve 5 floors. So officers could see what was happening on the screen. We had other officers in another part of the building that were on the assigned bridgehead. We had other officers who were doing lobby control, and they had radio interconnection. So we tried to make it as realistic as possible.
So it's basically a real-time exercise involving rapid external fire spread across 8 stories.
Absolutely. It was 5 to 8 stories.
Thank you. And I think I'm right in saying there was a 100% failure rate in the first 2 seminars. Is that right?
Absolutely. It was a situation typical of that we'd seen in Malaysia, where firefighters were thinking only of the first option, to fight the fire. And of course, with our 3-line attack, that was becoming quite a problem. We also found that the command teams weren't working or integrating well. That when they were looking at the screen, they were looking away to discuss things about other parts of the building, in the smoke control system, for example. And intervention was the only thing that they were thinking of.
And so it was after those 2 seminars where you had the 100% failure rate that the RICE model was brought in?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you've very helpfully provided as an exhibit to your third statement the PowerPoint presentation that was delivered to commanders as part of the high-rise training in 2010-11. And we can find that presentation at KFR quadruple 0057. And if we can skip to page 13, the slide's entitled Facades, and from page 13 onwards, you discuss in detail the mechanism by which, first of all, what facades are, and then the mechanism by which facade fires may spread. And if we see an example of that at page 15, you explain that. And then if we can go on to page 18, you have a slide that's focused expressly and solely on cladding system types. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we can go to page 21, you deal with a number of facade fires, and those photographs go through to page 33. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, were you aware that facade fires presented a particular risk in respect of which commanders needed to be trained?
Well, in Kent, we were very aware since 2009, before this course was put together, that we'd seen fires in Europe, particularly in Germany, spreading up the external walls. And my line manager asked me to undertake a review of which buildings might have that kind of hazard in Kent at that time. So we approached all the housing providers, the local authorities, over a period of time, and only one area came back and said that they had, I think it was about a dozen buildings that were recently renovated with expanded polystyrene foam as insulation. So we took the pictures from Europe and took the report to the high-rise strategy group, who decided that we needed to train firefighters and fire officers rather in this potential risk. So that's where the training course came from originally.
Now, you mentioned the date 2009 and a fire. Was that a fire in Thanet?
No, the 2009 was, I'm not sure if I sent an email to you as part of the evidence, but the email in 2009 showed how we'd approached the housing authorities, and Thanet was a particular authority that had come back and said that they have about 12, 15 buildings with external walls with polystyrene insulation.
And I think that email correspondence is an exchange between you and Rob Lawson, is that
That's
right?
correct.
That's right. And the 19th of November 2009, and we can find it at KFR quadruple 0059. I think in the line you see there at the very top, the following properties have been overclad with polystyrene foam. And you said that email provides details of our investigation into combustible external walls of tower blocks of flats in the Thanet area of Kent. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, you've gone through the process of investigating, collecting this information. What did you do with it next?
Well, as I say, we took the photographs that we had from fires in Germany, mainly, where polystyrene foam had caused external fire spread up the outside of buildings, and we took this information from this email to the high-rise strategy group in Kent, and they decided that we would have a training course for all officers, and that's where the two-day training course came from, and we started that in 2010.
And did that training course, indeed the RISE training, was it aimed at preparing commanders to evacuate a high-rise residential block without a pre-existing evacuation strategy?
Well, we already had the stair protection policy in, So that was our approach at that time from 2006 onwards. The intention was to talk through the high-rise policy in Kent and to demonstrate the fact that there were risks with facades, and this could happen in Kent because we had this risk, and certainly as I say, the final exercise that they had, the fire studio exercise, was to test them, to show them that evacuation was more important than firefighting in that situation.
And does it flow from that there was never a test under which commanders carried out an actual evacuation? It was all computer-based training?
It was computer-based training.
Now, you explain in your statement that the vast majority of commanders undertaking the assessment at the conclusion of the first two seminars were failing to achieve satisfactory outcomes, so we've discussed that. Now, in those first two seminars where the commanders were not performing well, the RICE model had not yet been introduced, is that right?
That's correct.
And so the commanders were just seeking to apply the guidance that they'd learned from TBF 15?
Yes.
Now, you explain in your statement that commanders in those first two seminars performed poorly because they were directing the majority of on-scene resources to control and extinguish an external wall fire as the fire continued to spread upwards, involving 5 floors in the building, in contrast to diverting staffing and prioritising an evacuation. Now, do you think the commanders responded in that way because the procedure set out in TBF 15 was insufficiently flexible?
Absolutely correct. The procedure, and this was the subject of debate for several years afterwards, since 2006 I know, but certainly when I was there, that it was an inflexible procedure. It was very prescriptive, and it didn't give commanders that much option to move away from what was determined. Part of the course, in fact the first day, was to take the language in the procedure and try and change it to make it flexible. So put emphasis on particular words like should, must, will, may, to change the language in a way that people or the officers could see that they could actually move away from the prescriptive process of the procedure. But even then, with that, it was still difficult to do so.
And was one of the lessons that flowed from this the need to prioritise the evacuation stage first, rather than focusing on extinguishment of the fire, particularly in circumstances where there's rapid fire spread?
Well, evacuation was not the primary concern. Protecting residents who were self-evacuating was the priority. So that's the first thing that we would concentrate on. Containment might be another action. Intervention might be another action. If we had enough doors that would protect the staircase as well as be able to fight the fire at the same time, we would try and achieve that.
Thank you. And just to illustrate the points you've been making in answer to these few questions, can we go back to the presentation that we looked at earlier with the training seminars, KFR quadruple 0 0048/31. Actually, it's a different fire spread, sorry, a different presentation, but here you're identifying the flaws with the TBF 15 approach.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, following the conclusion of these seminars, is it right that you prepared a report setting out your views and assessment?
Yes, I did.
And we can find that report at KFR quadruple 000039. And if we can go to page 2 and paragraph 1.5. And you say there this: it was demonstrated quite early on that when TBF 15 high-rise procedure is used for guidance, that task objectives that are actually achievable within the intentions of the document were not achieved due to the prescriptive nature and layout of the procedure itself. As examples, the need to prioritise wider evacuation over intervention, or containment over intervention were often objectives that were hindered by a procedure that offers an ABC approach to ensuring a series of stringent control measures are cited before intervention may occur. So drawing these various answers together, Dr. Grimwood, did the underperformance of commanders in the first two seminars lead you to believe that there needed to be a greater emphasis in training on the need to be able to formulate an appropriate strategic plan in response to the specific circumstances of an individual incident?
Yes, absolutely. That's why we changed the later seminars in respect of introducing the, which was then ICE, mnemonic, and asking them to concentrate more on other tactical options that are available. And that's where we saw some more success than we'd had in the first two seminars.
And flowing on from that, you say in your statement that, and the reference is at paragraph 14 of your first statement, KFR 0000040/5, you said that there were, quotes, outstanding improvements in the commander's ability to identify the appropriate strategic decision at the right time following introduction of what was then ICE.
Absolutely, yes.
Looking at that, can you help us as to how specifically their performance was, or how the improvements were outstanding?
Well, there was lots of two-way debate in the course, and we put a number of scenarios on what was not Fire Studio, but called Simulator 6, which was a less impressive, should I say, computer training model where we could put several scenarios up very quickly. And after each scenario, we would debate with the officers what their options were. They worked in groups of 3 or 4, and some came out with different options to others. So we debated what would have been the best option. And with that approach, by the time we got to Fire Studio on the last day, the improvements were greatly seen.
Thank you. Now, following this, you improved the model, and that's when it became RICE. And you exhibit a paper in which the proposed changes to ICE to make it into RICE were set out and proposed. That paper is at KFR 0000051. And if we go to page 3 in paragraph 4.1, and you say there are 3 phases detailed within TBF 15: assessment, reconnaissance and evacuation, and then intervention. And those are the 3 phases that we've already been discussing earlier on this morning. You go on at 4.2 to say this: while these phases serve to give structure to operational decisions and actions, there is a need to define flexible tactical options that can be employed, dependent on the outcomes of the initial assessment and reconnaissance. And then there is a diagram of the RICE model just below, and beneath that at paragraph 4.3, it says this: each of these options, options, not phases, which infers that they must be undertaken in isolation and in a set order, would be defined. Having these defined options would, then you set out 4 principal benefits. First, allow the IC, the incident commander, to implement effective actions relative to the circumstance they're confronted with far more quickly. Secondly, remove the one-fits-all approach currently present within TBF 15. Thirdly, allow more than one phase to be implemented at the same time. As an example, it would be feasible in certain conditions to evacuate whilst containing fire spread. Finally, assist in defining accurately the resources required at developing incidents. Now, does that approach summarise the way in which the RICE model is taught to incident commanders at Kent now?
Yes, it does.
What's been your assessment of the effects of a decade or so of RICE training on the quality of decision-making by incident commanders?
Well, it became a buzzword in Kent. Rice, everybody knew what rice was, everybody referred to it, and it was a snap question that you could ask any firefighter on a station. What does it mean? How do you relate to it? How's it used in a fire? An example I could give was that we had a training exercise in a high-rise building where the incident commander was, both appliances who were attending locally were still on the run. But by what I mean by that is that they were still available for emergency calls, unfortunately, because of low resources at the time. There were another 4 pumps on this exercise. Well, what happened was the first pump had already planned out what they were going to do, as sometimes happens on exercises, but they got called out the last minute to an emergency scene. The second officer on the other pump, who was a young officer, very inexperienced, suddenly became in charge of the whole incident and was told, right, formulate your plan, this is what we've got. And you could see the virtual panic come across his face. And the course coordinator said to him, stop, just think rice. And immediately he changed in his approach to it. You could see in his face that he knew exactly what he was looking for. So that was one example where everything went smoothly just by thinking of the one buzzword, so to speak.
Stopping there, on that particular example, did the young incident commander take each stage in sequence, i.e. RICE, or did he take it out of sequence?
No, it's very, very much drilled into them that when they use RICE, that they must choose the best option, not necessarily the first option, and they will go through the process. Firstly, is anybody involved in the flat? And we have triggers to make sure that this is not a general report, that we know that somebody is definitely in that flat. And if that's the case, then it's a rescue option. And by what I said earlier, that it's now a procedure, that would determine the procedure that we use for the rescue, which would be a single line attack.
Thank you. Now, what does experience suggest are the disadvantages or weaknesses of the RICE model?
Disadvantages or weakness? That's a good question. I'd have to really think on that one, because I don't see particularly any weaknesses in the procedure.
Put it differently, have you received any criticisms from incident commanders at Kent on the practical application of the RICE model? Personally,
no. It's now incorporated into all our incident command training. We have a command suite now, which is beyond the cinema screen. It's surround sound and virtual reality, and RICE forms very much a feature of that.
From outside Kent, are you aware of any criticisms of the RICE model?
Not criticisms. We initially used it with when we went to a regional approach. I'm not sure if you'll be coming on to that, but...
we will.
OK. It's certainly something that we introduced regionally. Not all fire services wanted to use it, although most did in the region. I haven't heard any criticism of it personally, but I've heard that some just think, no, we're not going to use that. Command decision makers must have the flexibility to make their own decisions. Well, the flexibility is built within the system. Currently, at the moment, there is another command mnemonic that's going around nationally, which is maybe forming part of the national operational guidance, still to be published. And the discussions there were that it's I think it's a 6 or 7 part mnemonic, which leads to more information perhaps, but takes away the flexibility and is more difficult to remember.
Thank you. Now, in paragraph 7 of your first statement, the reference is KFR *0004040/3, and the first sentence of that paragraph, you refer there to the introduction of the North American concept of rapid ascent teams during the training of Kent's commanders in 2010 and 2011. and you state that the concept of rapid ascent teams was developed following a 2003 fire in Chicago, in which 6 people died in a smoke-filled stairwell. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely correct.
Was that the Cook County building fire that reference is found elsewhere?
Yes, it was.
And that was a 37-storey building where a fire broke out on the 12th floor, I think.
Yes.
And again, smoke had filled the stairwell through doors being propped open by hoses. Is that, again, a fair summary?
Yes, it is.
Is it right to say that rapid ascent teams are assigned early in the incident and that their role is to use the fire-protected routes, including the stairwell and corridors, to ensure the safety of occupants within those spaces who may be self-evacuating?
Yes, and the important part of what you said there is early in the incident, very early, in fact, almost on arrival.
Am I right in saying that the rapid ascent teams patrol stairwells continuously during the course of an incident, or is it confined to the early stages?
They're permanently assigned to the stairwells and the corridors adjoining.
And that's to make sure that egress routes are safe and kept free of obstacles?
And nobody's in trouble up there.
And if someone was found to be trouble, would the rapid ascent teams be responsible for bringing that individual out of the building?
Yes, they would. They absolutely communicate that to the bridgehead or forward command, and they would be responsible for. Depends on their circumstances. If it was somebody overcome, they would rescue them. If it was somebody who was suffering from smoke inhalation, they would perhaps remove them to a tenable area.
And the rapid ascent teams, just flowing from the answer you gave, would also be responsible for communicating back to the bridgehead their assessment of prevailing conditions within the building.
Exactly.
Now, are those rapid ascent teams different from the stairwell protection teams that TBF 15 referred to?
Well, rapid ascent teams was very familiar to me because this particular fire, I was commissioned as an expert witness in Chicago. So I became very aware of the developments of what occurred in that fire and how Chicago Fire Department dealt with it. Rapid ascent teams formed the first discussion in our seminars in 2010, 2011. And we had no formal guidance or approach to how we would deploy firefighters above the bridgehead into stairwells. It was very much an ad hoc approach. So I suggested that we discussed it and would it be a good idea. There were some factors in TBF 15 as a procedure that would maybe hinder that, and that's where we worked with the language again of it. But certainly it was a concept at the time that officers accepted an organised approach done or implemented early in an incident, and it was a good idea.
Thank you. Can I now turn on to a separate topic, which is the South East Task and Finish High-Rise Group, I think operated between 2011 and 2012, and the standard operating procedure. Now, I'd now, first of all, want to talk to you about your involvement in the Collaborative Regional High-Rise Task and Finish Group, which you refer to in your first witness statement at paragraph 8. Now, that was a group that included 9 fire and rescue services from the southeast region of this country, apart from London. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it was an initiative launched by the Chief Fire Officers Association. Is that right?
Yes.
And the group was established in order to research and agree common operational procedures for responding to fires in high-rise buildings. Is that right?
Yes.
And ordinarily it's up to individual fire and rescue services to develop and implement their own local policies and procedures, incorporating, as they deem appropriate, any national guidance. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you explain the rationale for these 9 different FRSs collaborating for these purposes?
Well, so this was part of what we called the Ways of Working project, which was around that time where they were going to reorganise the approach to firefighting and fire command, fire controls in the UK, where they were going to have regional controls So you would have a control in Guildford, say, for example, that would accept calls from maybe 9 fire services around. The idea was to cut the number of controls and coordinate them together. So this was part of the same project that we were directed to formulate policy that would be able to enable fire services to work together with the same procedures.
Why was London not involved?
London were an area of their own in the same project.
Was there any collaboration with London on the issues that you were discussing, for example, in the context of high-rise buildings?
Not at that time, but certainly we were called in to meet with them pre-publication of GRA 3.2 in 2014.
Was that for the purposes of consultation or something else?
Yeah, it was consultation. It was certainly, we wanted to know what the GRA was likely to say, and I think London wanted to know what we were going to say, and I think they were perhaps meeting with other areas as well.
What was the precise role that CFOA, that's the Chief Fire Officers Association, what was their precise role in setting this up? Or in the initiative more broadly, I should say.
So CFOA was the representative organisation for chief fire officers, would be the equivalent of the NFCC now, and they would have various regional groups that would organise and arrange these particular collaborations between fire services.
Thank you. Now, if we can go to KFR *00040/7 on paragraph 19. Now, you say in paragraph 19, in the first sentence, third line, that there had been an evaluation of stay put versus evacuation strategy in 2011 by this regional group. Now, can you explain the background to that evaluation?
So, stay put was always of concern, whether it was a good policy or whether it was a bad policy, but it was certainly a policy that was by design of the buildings. But there were considerations from the fire service point of view that as much as people were asked to stay put, that they should always have an egress route out of the building. And there were disconnects, which I say there, disconnects between the building design and the firefighting procedures that were being seen, where they would put the rising mains in the stair and expect firefighters to fight a fire but still allow smoke to enter the staircase.
What did the evaluation involve?
The strategy group for the region was about 20 strong from the 9 fire services involved, and I would say probably at each meeting we would probably get about 12 to 15, and the meetings were about once a quarter.
Yeah.
And the discussion on the day for stay put is difficult to recollect. I know I was there, but it was one of those solutions that was never resolved.
Where do you stand, or where did you stand in the debate between the advantages and disadvantages of stay put?
Well, this was a fairly early stage with the regional procedures being formulated, and from Kent we were very strong in saying we want to protect the stairwell. That's our priority. We want better design. We want the designs to look at moving the rising main. Then we had opposition from other fire services who would say, no, the rising main should stay in the stair because it's a firefighting shaft and firefighters are safer from in approaching from that area. You know, it was a difficult one with so many opinions.
And there was no one there to arbitrate between the conflicting views, is that right?
Well, I think the arbitration, because the review panel for the region was run by East Sussex Fire and Rescue, and their approach to it was understanding that this is a problem that's difficult to resolve. We see both sides of the argument, but I think the general consensus was that we should be prioritising that stair protection. And if we couldn't do it by design, then we would do it by procedure.
And so, I put this crudely, Kent's view was the generally prevailing one, although there was no unanimity of agreement.
Very much so, yeah.
Thank you. Now, you've helpfully exhibited a copy of the Standard Operating Procedure, which is referred to as a SOP, and that was developed by this particular group. And if we go to it, it's a KFR 0000049. Now, I think you say in paragraph 8 of your first witness statement that this procedure includes Kent's stairwell protection strategies and the RICE concept. And the document is recorded as having been issued in October 2013. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, did this document replace TBF 15?
This document replaced, for Kent, TBF 15 2012 version.
And so, what can you help us? Is standard operating procedure, is that identical to a policy, or is it something below the status of policy?
It's the same as policy or procedure. It's a standard operating procedure.
And would you, or would a risk assessment be carried out of the substantive provisions of a SOP before it was promulgated?
Absolutely, yes.
And who would have carried out that risk assessment?
Each fire service involved, all the 9 fire services, would carry out their own risk assessment. Our own risk assessment in Kent would be done by the various bodies, such as the Health and Safety Department, the Operations Department, Training Department, and certainly the Fire Brigade Union.
And I suppose you would be, on what you say there, you would be kept outside of the risk assessment process, would you?
Me personally?
Or your department?
Yes.
Can you explain what status this SOP had in other fire and rescue services who form part of the group of 9?
So the main body of this would be exactly the same. There are a few additions, I think, on the end of it, where we added some particular information about flow rates and the importance of having adequate water to fight the fire.
And just flowing on from a question I asked some time ago, I think I'm right in saying that not all of the 9 adopted this SOP.
Every fire service, all 9 adopted it.
But not necessarily the RICE model.
But not everyone adopted RICE, correct.
And the reason for the resistance to RICE was the anxiety to maintain the maximum degree of incident commander discretion.
Yeah, I think there was no resistance to it. I think everybody, because I gave a presentation to the group and everybody representing at that meeting loved it, but it just didn't make its way into all of the procedures.
Now, in broad terms, I think I'm right in saying that the SOP mirrored the procedure set out in TB15 to a great extent.
It was almost a direct lift of the 2012 version.
And just to illustrate that, can we go through a number of elements of it just so the point can be made good? If we can go to page 23. And there we have the 3-line procedure, the reconnaissance team who lay out the 2 hoses on the fire floor, which reflected its predecessor, I think.
Yes, what you see here is a different floor layout without the lobby. That was one of the problems with the original TBF 15 procedure, that it showed firefighters that there was always going to be a lobby there. That wasn't the case. Many buildings now don't have the lobby between the stair, and the accommodation just one door.
Thank you. And if we go to page 25, we see there, as in TBF 15, the stairwell protection team coming up behind them and remaining in the stairwell. Is that right?
That's the lobby approach procedure.
Thank you. And if we go to page 26, we see in the diagram at the top of the page the fire floor protection team, who take one of the charge hoses on the fire floor and are responsible for maintaining the integrity of the fire floor itself. We see those displayed, and that again reflects its predecessor. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
And then looking at the bottom diagram on page 26, we see here the fire attack team, and again that reflected its predecessor. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, I think I'm right in saying, but please shout if this is wrong, that the Rice model isn't explicitly set out in the SOP.
It refers to a tactical framework.
And it's that phrase which is meant to refer the reader to the Rice model.
It's the document that was called, I think you pointed it out earlier, which was an incomplete version of the tactical framework.
Thank you. Can you help us? Was your Rice model, or indeed the concept of stairwell protection teams, disseminated or discussed more widely outside the regional group of 9 in the South East?
It was discussed at that time only by the regional team and also by London Fire Brigade.
What was the LFB's response to the Rice model, or the concept of stairwell protection?
Interest is the best way I could put it. We had a meeting with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner, and he showed great interest in it. He held some concerns about the stair protection procedure, in that it was moving away from what was normal national procedure in terms of approaching the fire from the fire floor and not the floors below.
Thank you. Those are the discussions with DAC COWUP, aren't they?
Correct.
Thank you. We'll come into those,
Okay.
for understandably, in more detail.
Yes.
Did the CFOA, did that take any steps to disseminate the Rice model or the concept of stairwell protection to its various other members outside the South East?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you know why they didn't?
They may have, because I think the way the ways of working project worked, each particular region had a policy to develop. So ours happened to be high rise, and I think it was probably chosen because we had lots to say in Kent at the time. And there were lots of incidents around that time in the South East region. But I think other areas, other regions would have done things like road traffic accidents and policies for other things. So ours was high-rise firefighting, and whether it got sent around, because the project ended and the separate control regional areas never developed. The whole project was closed.
Thank you. Now, you've adverted to these discussions with DAC COWUP. They were held in September 2011, is that right?
Yes.
And you say, we don't need to go to it, but you say in paragraph 23 of your first witness statement, which is at KFR *0004040/8, that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss with DAC COWUP how the work of the regional task group might align with the work he was undertaking in updating GRA 3.2. In broad terms, is that a fair summary?
That's correct.
At that stage, what was your awareness of the state of revision of GRA 3.2?
We'd seen a draft, and we considered it a big step forward in terms of there was much more information than the previous 2008 version, but there was nothing that we would sign up for, so to speak, because it didn't have anything of the stair protection within that document. So that's where the debate came.
Thank you. Now, following on from that, it may be useful to go to paragraph 24 of your first witness statement, which is at KFR *000040/8, and you say there that you discussed stairwell protection strategies and the RISE model with DAC COWUP, and in the third sentence, and this flows from an answer you gave earlier on, Mr. COWUP pointed out, I think you put this euphemistically, some disconnect, to quote, between the tactical approaches that you were proposing and those that had been used in London and elsewhere in the UK. Now, can you help us? What were the tactical approaches that concerned Mr. COWUP? Was it RISE and the stairwell protection policy more broadly?
No, I think RISE was just, it wasn't at conflict with anything. It was just an interesting introduction to Mr. COWUP, but he was more concerned with the stair protection approach that Kent and the region were now taking, in that we were prioritising the protection of the stairwells wherever we could, and we were attacking from the fire floor instead of going from the floors below.
As advocated by GRA 3.2?
Yes.
And did he give a reasoned criticism of your focus on the stairwell protection policy?
I think it was firefighter safety was the main concern. You know, there are several building layouts, obviously. The rising main may well be in the lobby itself. And the view was that if firefighters go into that lobby, they can, you know, open up the door and a wind-driven fire can come through and cause them problems. And that was exactly the scenario that occurred in 2001 that caused Kent to put into place a stair protection policy.
Now, earlier on, we discussed the various means you can take to mitigate the risk of connecting on the fire floor. Did you discuss those means of mitigation with Mr. COWUP when you were debating these matters with him in September 2011?
I think it's hard to recollect exact conversations, but certainly the basis of the conversation would have been about the regional approach, which was all about stair protection, maintaining integrity of the escape routes. These were the important issues that we discussed.
Did you have any view as to what guidance ought to be included in the revised GRA 3.2 in relation to stairwell protection?
Well, we would like to have seen a procedure that had been accepted by 9 fire and rescue services, at least provided as an option, an optional approach.
Did you propose that explicitly to Mr. COWUP?
I can't remember.
Can you remember now, and I'm mindful this is a decade ago.
Yes.
Can you remember now the gist of Mr. COWUP's response to incorporation of the stairwell protection policy, even as an alternative?
Yes, I can't say that I remember putting that to him directly as an option, but it was something that we certainly agreed in Kent and the region that we would like to have seen it in some way written into the guidance.
Would it be fair to summarise matters this way, that Mr. COWUP neither ruled it in nor ruled it out?
I think he ruled it out.
And you're clear that he expressly rejected it?
Well, to be fair, Mr. COWUP wouldn't make that decision. I think he would have taken it back to his own strategy group, and that decision would have probably been made there.
But is your memory that his views were sufficiently negative?
Yes.
Thank you. Did you discuss the evacuation element of the RISE model with Mr. COWUP?
Only from the point of view of RISE, that we explained certainly I remember talking to him about the training courses that we had run quite recently, that we'd use RICE as a tactical decision maker tool, and that it had great success, and that sometimes evacuation needs to be prioritised over intervention.
What can you remember now what his response was to the lessons you'd learned in Kent?
Very little response, other than I think he was interested. He didn't say no to RICE because it wasn't at conflict with any procedural approaches.
Did you encourage GRA 3.2 to include, for example, more advice on the various means by which high-rise residential buildings might be evacuated if the need arose?
Well, you know, I think we always have to remember that the GRAs are risk assessments, that they don't provide procedure, that they provide guidance that you should follow in some way or other. And, you know, I think the points we were making, and he had copies of our procedures, that the integrity of the stair was a prime concern for us. It wasn't an afterthought, it was right up front there.
Now, you also say that you discussed the concept of operational discretion with Mr. Cowap, is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And you also discuss fire survival guidance calls, is that also right?
That's correct.
Mindful this was a decade ago.
Yes.
Can you remember now the gist of that element of the conversation?
Yes, I can. It was an important part of the conversation because basically we'd never really heard of operational discretion. It was something that was quite new at the time. There was no documented procedures. There were research papers about it. Operational discretion seemed to excite Mr. Cowap. He saw it as a major part of the GRA, the revision, and we discussed operational discretion, what it meant to firefighters, and I think there was a general view in the room that instead of having operational discretion for foreseeable events, because that to us was something that could be foreseen in many areas, that you should have a procedure written for it, and not something that was almost a get-out clause.
Now, we have an email exchange between you, Mr. Cowap, from August 2011, so a few weeks before you met in September. And we can find that at LFB 000-98811. And if we could go to the bottom of page 2 of that email chain, we see it's the very end of that page. This is the trigger email that you sent to him on the 25th of August 2011. It's timed at 12:58. And you say, "Hello, Pete." So presumably you knew him well.
Yes.
Hoping all is well with you. And if we turn over the page, apologies for reading this out, but it's probably helpful for the record. If we go over the page. Thank you. As you see, I'm now working for Kent FRS as part of the Technical Fire Safety Team. I'm also responsible for delivering high-rise command training and sit on the Kent Fire and Rescue Service and South East Regional High-Rise T&F groups. T&F?
Task and finish.
Thank you. In fact, I believe we have a representative meeting with you on September the 15th at Surrey HQ. Peter, it interests me to meet with you again, not simply because it's been a while, but because I'm particularly keen to generate greater awareness within our service and region of the benefits in developing risk-based approaches that coordinate with the aims and objectives of the national revisions of the GRA that I note you are leading on. It is my view that we need to address and coordinate fire growth potential, fire load, with suppressive capacity and resource limitations, and this is a topic that generates current discussion of some interest. In simple terms, taking environmental or criminal influence out, a flat fire is likely to be more approachable than a developing fire in a large and unprotected office space. Now, can you explain what you mean here when you said we need to address and coordinate fire growth potential, fire load, with suppressive capacity and resource limitations?
So at that time, this was a particular topic in Kent, and me personally, because I was doing a PhD in matching fire load with the amount of water that's used. And it was concerning that we were discharging the same amount of water or deploying the same amount of water into a flat fire as we were an open plan office fire. And the rising mains were set up as well in design in relation to they would provide the same amount of water whether it was for an office or a flat. And the fire loads and the compartment sizes were obviously different.
Thank you.
I just go on to say that at that time, the regional approach to developing our procedure was also for offices. It was a generic procedure, but that was later cancelled because it was going to take more time, and the project itself overall had been cancelled. So we finished with a flat procedure, just flats.
Now, in the third paragraph from the end of that email, you say this: the concepts of fire containment are now becoming critical, and building design and legislation is not following pace with the potential for exterior fire spread. Now, can you again explain what you meant when you used that phrase?
So this was 2011, going back to 2009 when we discovered that there were elements of external walls that were combustible in Kent and surely everywhere else probably, that it was concerned that in 2010 we had directed the main bulk of our training towards external wall fires. And, you know, I think I'm making the point there that building design and legislation is not keeping up with it.
And that phrase speaks for itself in your view.
Yeah.
Now, did you discuss the risks of external fire spread with Mr. Cowap at the meeting in September?
Yes.
Can you remember now the gist of what you said to him and what his response was to you?
The conversation would have been around our training course, how we had trained fire officers. We'd identified a risk. We trained fire officers in the risk. We would like that to go in the GRA. That would be the gist. I can't remember his response.
When you say that would have been, that would be, are you saying that's what you said?
Well, it's difficult again to recollect what I said, but the whole conversation, and I do remember having a conversation saying that we've identified a problem, that we've trained our officers in the problem, and that we were now training our firefighters in the problem, and that something should be included in the GRA.
Thank you. And the fires that you had in mind were those between, I think, pages 21 and 32 of the slideshow presentation you provided?
Yes.
You mentioned there training provided to firefighters as opposed to incident commanders. What was the substance of that training?
So as soon as we'd completed the 2-year training of level 1 to 4 officers, we decided on the strategy group that firefighters were the most important sort of part of the jigsaw, that they should also be aware of procedures. So I undertook training of most of our whole-time fire stations between 2011 and 2015.
And really, it's training on what to look out for and how to respond.
Well, the fact that external wall fires exist, particularly in certain areas of the county, that pictures, same as we saw there, that was shared with firefighters, and that, rice becomes even more important when you think about evacuating occupants before we intervene.
Was any training given on different types of construction materials for firefighters to look out for? I'm obviously thinking of cladding here.
The same presentation that you've put on there was briefed down to, I think it was a 3-hour seminar, which firefighters would have, and those slides were discussed, different types of wall construction with wall cavities and range screens and underneath insulation. To be fair, we were never aware of anything like ACM at that time.
But the slide you're thinking of is the one I think that was at page 18 of the slideshow, which I took you to earlier on,
Yes.
which was headed cladding.
Yes.
And going back on an answer you gave, evacuation was something on which not only incident commanders but also firefighters were trained at Kent, is that right?
Integrity of the stairwell and evacuation may become a priority.
Thank you. Can we go back to this email chain? And if we go back to page 2 in that email chain, we find Mr. Carrap's response on the 26th of August, right, so the day after you sent the email. It says, Paul, thanks for your note. I'm sure that you will appreciate that the GRA is a risk assessment rather than an operating procedure or training document, so I would not anticipate that it will go into the detail of what you do or how you fight a high-rise fire. Rather, its focus will be on identifying all relevant hazards at such incidents and outlining possible control measures. It is then for each FRS to undertake their own service-specific risk assessment as a basis for their operational procedure and consequent training materials intervention. No doubt these are issues we will discuss further in due course. And then if we can go to page 1 in this chain, you responded the same day, nearly 20 minutes later, thus, Morning, Pete. Thanks for your response. Most certainly I fully appreciate the document is a risk assessment that offers guidance in identifying and dealing with typical hazards and implementing control measures. However, perhaps my case was poorly placed, but in short, I am suggesting that control measures vary according to fire-involved compartment size, and perhaps this might be considered in the GRA. The issue we're having in the southeast region that has caused some debate is that our procedure is time-dependent. That is, it causes some delay while sufficient control measures are placed. This means that if we are dealing with a flat fire, the likelihood is that it will not spread beyond the average 70 square metres compartment, 60-minute box, and therefore we can deploy sufficient water to deal using a single attack hose line with safety lines and support. If, however, we are dealing with a larger commercial compartments in high-rise, the same procedural approach may allow a fire to develop during the time we are setting up additional safety lines, and yet we are still only going to deploy one attack line initially. In such a case, an earlier intervention may actually reduce the danger to firefighters, where the fire size is smaller, or more importantly, vice versa. Our procedure does not acknowledge this fact, so I'm wondering if you are planning to mention or identify the relation between prompt intervention and limitations or suppressive capacity of single attack hose lines. Now, that's a long email, but would it be accurate to say that what you're suggesting here is the operational response to a single compartment fire in a residential high-rise may need to be different from the operational response to a fire in a larger compartment, for example, in a commercial high-rise building?
That's correct.
And that is because you might expect fire spread to be better contained in the single compartment in a residential high-rise building.
That's what one would expect.
Can I now turn to the separate question of smoke hoods and smoke curtains, which we touched on earlier on? The inquiry understands that since Grenfell, Kent has started using smoke hoods and smoke curtains as part of its operational response to high-rise fires. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, in relation to hoods, is it correct that these hoods are intended to be used by members of the public who are being evacuated or assisted to evacuate?
Correct.
And they provide a certain period of protection from noxious fumes and smoke?
Yes.
How long is the protection that's provided?
15 minutes.
Can you briefly explain for us how the hoods are used?
So the hoods are basically just worn over the head and tightened up. They can breathe through a filter, but the filter will only give protection for 15 minutes.
How effective have you found these hoods to be in practice, assuming they've been deployed?
They've been deployed several times. I don't have the data on that. The firefighters, are really happy with them because they can take people through smoke-laden areas knowing that the persons aren't going to be harmed.
Now, if I can turn briefly to smoke curtains, how effective have you found them to be in practice where they've been deployed?
Again, similar experiences, feedback coming weekly almost from the use of smoke curtains, restricts the spread of smoke throughout the building. Very good effect.
Thank you. Dr. Grimwood, sir, I've come to the end of my prepared questions just before lunch. I'm in your hands, sir, as to how you wish to handle it. Clearly, I'd be grateful for an opportunity to review any further questions that may be required or to consider any further questions that are proposed. Yes. Might I ask you to rise until, say, 2:15, which gives people the opportunity to eat something and also to consider what further questions they would like to suggest?
Well, Dr. Grimwood, at this stage of the proceedings, we need to have a break, partly to enable counsel here to check that he hasn't left anything out that he ought to have asked you, and also to allow other people who are not here but who are following the proceedings to suggest other questions that perhaps we should put to you. I imagine you had planned to be here for the whole of the day,
The entire day, sir, yeah.
Right. Well, in that case, I think it might be convenient if we stop now for lunch and to give counsel a chance to have lunch and consider the questions. I think we will break, as Mr. Kinnear has suggested, until 2:15, slightly longer than usual, but there are things to be done in that time. And then at 2:15, we'll come back and see whether there are any more questions that we need to ask you.
Thank you, sir.
Is that all right?
That's fine.
And again, while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence.
Absolutely.
Or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you, sir.
Right. Would you like to go with the usher then, please? Right, Mr. Kinnear. Well, 2:15 ought to give enough time for various things that need to be done.
One would hope. Thank you, sir.
Good. Thank you. 2:15 then, please.